Oh, that's like a bee or something.
In the summer of 2024, the Maine New Farmers Project invited Dr. Kendall Samuelson of West Texas A&M to Maine to talk to producers about feed sampling, analysis, and ration formulation.
Hi, I'm Dr. Kendall Samuelson. I'm an associate professor at West Texas A&M University, and I'm going to talk to you today about feed sampling and analysis. So the first question we always ask is, what is the point of sampling? Why would I even do that? Is that worth the expense and the time and effort that it takes me to do so? Well, regular feed sampling is pretty important. It can be used for a couple of different reasons. The first is essentially just to understand the type and concentrations of the nutrients that are found in different feeds that you're bringing in. That can be important for a couple reasons. One, for quality control, so to make sure I'm getting a consistent product, to make sure that I'm actually receiving the product that I paid for. And the other is to determine the nutrient composition of that feed stuff. So that is very important also if I'm formulating a diet myself, or if I'm making different combinations of ingredients to make a very simple diet. I need to be able to understand what I'm working with to make sure that I'm meeting the nutrient requirements of those animals. In addition, we can also look for different things like toxins to make sure that the feed that we're providing to these animals. So when we get our feedstuffs in, we want to do a couple of things. And the first thing before we even get to the sampling point is we want to visually inspect those, whether it's a feed ingredient, whether it's a diet that I'm getting in. I don't want to just buy that feed and put it in a barn and not look at it again for a couple weeks or a couple months or whatever. I want to open one of those bags or open that tote or go out wherever I'm having maybe a truckload unloaded or whatever it is, and I want to visually inspect that feed. And so what am I actually looking for when I do that? Well, we can see a lot of things just by looking at the feed. First, am I unloading it and storing it in the right conditions where I'm going to be able to keep that feed and keep it fresh for however long I need to keep it before I use it or as I'm using it. The other thing that I want to look at is just some of the physical characteristics of that feed. So is the color what I would expect? Is there any off odors? Is the texture normal? Is the particle size of that feed typical? Is it more broken up or less broken up than I would like it to be? Is there any foreign objects that are within that feed stuff? You would be surprised at the amount of foreign objects that you could actually find in your feeds. And is there any spoilage, any molds, any physical toxins that I can see? And that first physical inspection is really important because it helps me to determine, did I buy something I can actually use? And is what I paid for that feed stuff actually the right price? If you have any negative quality attributes, that is not a feed that you want to buy, or at least not a feed that you want to pay full price for. So you need to make sure initially that you're getting the right thing. So the next step after the physical inspection is to actually go through and sample those feeds and potentially send them off for analysis. And so how we actually sample these feeds is very different depending on the type of feed stuff that we're dealing with. And also different if we're sampling an actual feed stuff itself as opposed to a TMR or a total mixed ration that either you make or you purchase. And so depending on the ingredient type, I'll talk a little bit about ingredients first and then talk about the total mixed ration. But depending on ingredient type, there may be different sampling techniques that you would use when you take a sample. Typically, you're going to take those samples on all commodities that you would receive by hand. And so how you actually do that is very important. There's a lot more that goes into sample collection than you would actually think. And so the first question is, how do you actually want to go up to a pile or a bag of something and physically take that sample out? And an important consideration for that is that you want to get all of the sample. So you want that sample to be representative, and you also want that sample to be random. So you don't want to target a certain area that looks better or looks worse and take that sample. You really want that sample to be a good example of the entire feed stuff that you're purchasing. And so the best way to do that is with something that will not let you drop any of that sample. So you can use a feed scoop, a coffee can, something like that, or you can just use your hand. However, if you use your hand, how you actually go in and do the sample is very important. You want to hold all of your fingers very tightly together when you go in and take that sample, and you want to reach in and lift up, keeping your palm up, so that all of that feed stays within your palm. If you were to take the sample like this and grab it and lift up, you're going to have loss of that sample as you're moving that sample from wherever you're taking it to wherever you're going to mix and kind of prepare your sample setup. So that is kind of the first part, is how I actually go in and physically take the sample, whether it's with my hands or a feed scoop or whatever. The next question is, how many samples do I actually want to take? And so very rarely do you want to go in and just take one single sample, because again, you want to have a representative sample of the entire amount of feed that you're purchasing. So in order to do that, you need to take multiple samples and kind of blend them together. And how I do that may look a little bit different than depending on what I'm sampling. So if I'm sampling just a bulk ingredient, that's more of a loose type ingredient, something, let's say like corn or soybean meal or barley or something like that, those samples are going to be relatively easy to take. It's going to be easy to walk up to a pile of that feed stuff and just get various samples. And so generally what you want to do is take typically at least 3 to 5 samples from a pile, and you're ultimately going to do what we call compositing those samples, which means that we're blending all of those different individual samples together. So if you were to look at a pile, you would kind of divide it up almost into quadrants. You're going to walk up to that and kind of take a sample from multiple locations within that pile. Now, if I'm taking a different type of feed stuff, let's say for example, some hay, how I would actually take that sample is a little bit different. And so instead of using something like my hand or a coffee cup, I would use a hay probe to do that. A hay probe is going to give you a more representative sample. It allows you to kind of core into that hay bale and get a much better sample than if you were to try to kind of break it apart and use your hands to pick through. Another important consideration with hay sampling is leaf shatter. And so we want to make sure that we're getting all of those components of the hay into that sample. How I take that core sample also depends on the type of hay bale that I'm using. So for example, if I'm taking a round bale, I'm going to want to go in and take that sample from the curved side of the bale. If I'm taking a rectangular or a square bale, I want to take that from kind of the short end of the bale so that it goes through all of the various flakes that are in the bale. And the reason why that is because if I'm going through different flakes, or if I'm going through different sections that have been rolled up in that round bale, I'm getting a really good representation of multiple areas in the field that would have been harvested for that hay, instead of just one flake, which would really just represent one single spot in the field and not be a good overall picture of what you're dealing with. And so that sampling location is really important. The other thing is that I want to take multiple samples of multiple bales within the load that I purchased, because there can be some variation throughout a field when you harvest and things like that. The other thing that I might sample could be silage, and with silage, there is some additional considerations with sampling. One of those is safety. You have to be very careful around silage piles for them shelving off and things like that. It really kind of depends what your pile looks like, but you need to use your best judgment a little bit on that. And that sampling could be done with a hay probe. It could also be done with your hand, similar to what we talked about in the regular commodities, where you're kind of partitioning that silage pile and you're taking a sample from the face that is representative of multiple different areas. Another thing you may have to sample would be your pasture. For example, if you have animals on pasture and you're trying to come up with some supplementation program, so you want to know what you're working with on your pasture. And you can use sampling there for a couple things. One, just looking at the quality, but two, also using it as an estimate of forage amount. And so there's several different ways to go through and take samples there. You could take clip samples. You could do kind of a bite analysis where you're actually selecting certain plants that may be most representative of what the animal is eating, or the most common method would probably be to use a quadrat, which is either a square or a circle that you're going to throw out at random into the field and select different areas that you're then going to clip and combine to get a good representative view of that pasture. And so then you can either send that off for analysis, or you can actually weigh it to determine the amount of forage that's present in your field as well. So another place that we can sample, in addition to just sampling our individual ingredients, is to actually take a sample of our diet or our TMR. And so this provides us with a little bit of different information compared to our individual ingredients. Our individual ingredients are telling us what the nutrient concentrations that we have are. They're telling us a little bit about the quality. But if we want to mix a diet, or we're purchasing a diet, that is what we're actually going to feed to the animal. So it gives us a good view overall of what the animal is eating. It can tell us, is the nutrient requirements of this animal being met? It can tell us, if I'm mixing my own feed, is that mixer working correctly? And those are really important things that I want to know about when I'm investing time and effort to put a diet together for livestock. So when you take a diet sample or a TMR sample, you're going to use a lot of the same methods that we've talked about previously, and take multiple samples, and you want to take a representative sample. So a question that comes up quite a lot is, where should I actually take that sample? If I'm purchasing a TMR, should I take that out of the bag? Should I take that out of the feed bucket where I'm feeding the animals? If I'm mixing my own diet, do I take that out of the mixer? And so I think that the best place that we can have to take a sample is the best representation of what the animal is actually eating. So whether I'm putting something in a feed trough or a feed bunk, or however I'm feeding that, I want to get that sample as close to the animal eating it as I possibly can. Again, you want to use that closed hand, up facing hand technique, or use a feed scoop or something like that, so you don't miss any of the diet. Sometimes it can be challenging to take a representative sample of a diet depending on what type of diet you're sampling. If you have a complete ration or a complete diet with a lot of different minerals, and maybe there's some meals, some fine particles in there, that certainly can be much harder to sample. So you want to use care when you're sampling those to make sure that you have all the ingredients included, because a lot of the protein and minerals and things like that can typically be in the fines that are falling out. And so once you have all of those samples together, whether you're sampling an ingredient, something like hay or silage, or the TMR as we discussed previously, you should end up with multiple samples. Remember, I mentioned 3 to 5 samples probably from each ingredient or diet is ideal. And usually what happens at that point is your sample that you've collected is too large to fit into a sample bag that you would want to send to the lab. So you have to decrease the size of that sample, and you want to do it in a way that makes sense and still is getting you a good quality sample to send to the lab. So how we do that is composite everything into a bucket, get a very thorough mix on it, and then we use what's called the quadrant method to decrease that sample size. And I'll show a picture up here on the screen. But essentially you take that sample and you put it out on a tarp or on a clean surface, and you're going to divide it into quarters. And 2 of those quarters you're going to discard, and the other 2, if they're small enough to fit into the bag, you'll put them into your sample bag. If they're still too large, you're going to mix them and continue doing the quadrant method again and reducing that sample further and further until it can fit within your bag. Once that sample fits within the bag, then you're really at the last step. All you have to do is close it up, determine what analyses that you would like to run, and then send it off to the lab for nutrient analysis.
This video was brought to you by the University of Maine Cooperative Extension Grazing Behavior Lab, the Maine New Farmers Project, and we would like to extend a special thanks to Dr. Kendall Samuelson of West Texas A&M University. If you would like to learn more about Dr. Samuelson, tune in to our upcoming episode of the Maine Farmcast on October 30th. That will be episode 26. And once again, thank Thanks for watching.
Oh, that's like a bee or something. What is that? It's following me. Is it still there? I don't think I turned this thing on.
I turned it on.
Oh, okay.
Don't worry, you're not responsible for any technology.
Okay, that's good. Because that would not end well for anybody.
It's gonna make a good